Ever feel like there's maybe a secret history to ancient beliefs, something kind of hidden beneath the surface?
Oh, definitely.
Well, today on the deep dive, we're plunging into Gnosticism. It's this really fascinating spiritual current from the early centuries CE.
Right.
You share some, well, pretty compelling material looking at its roots, and honestly, it's a wild mix.
It really is. A lot going on there.
So our mission today is to try and untangle this for you, maybe pinpoint the key insights.
Yeah.
And look at some genuinely surprising connections. We're talking Egyptian thought, Greek philosophy, Jewish tradition.
It's quite the blend. So I suppose at its core, Gnosticism is this idea, that there's a divine spark inside us.
Trapped.
Exactly, trapped in this physical world. And getting free means acquiring special knowledge, what they actually called gnosis.
Okay. And they weren't big fans of creation itself, were they?
Not really, no. They often saw it as flawed, maybe the work of a lesser being, not the true supreme God who exists, way beyond all this.
And this was happening when...
It really flourished around the 2nd century CE, mostly, right alongside early Christianity.
But not like one single church.
No, more like a collection of different groups, various viewpoints, all exploring these kinds of ideas.
Right. Okay, so let's dig into the Egyptian angle first. The sources you shared mentioned this ancient Egyptian concept of gnosis itself.
Yeah, that's a key starting point. And you have figures like Hermes Trismegistus.
Linked to Thoth, the wisdom god.
Precisely. And associated with that famous saying, know thyself, know the all.
And that sounds, well, pretty Gnostic, doesn't it?
It really does resonate. What's also interesting is this potential link between the Gnostic idea of divine emanation.
Like a spiritual unfolding.
Sort of, yeah. And maybe similar concepts you find in Egyptian cosmology. Some sources even draw parallels between the Gnostic underworld and the Egyptian umThe.
The realm of the dead.
Uh-huh. And we see actual Egyptian elements popping up in specific Gnostic texts like Pistis Sophia or the books of Jude.
And didn't finding the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt basically change everything?
Oh, completely. Huge discovery. Suddenly we had firsthand access to these Gnostic scriptures, things like the Gospel of Thomas or the Apocryphon of John. Really opened things up.
Okay, so moving from Egypt,
yeah,
let's talk Greece. Platonism, how does that fit in?
Well, Alexandria was a massive intellectual hub, right?
Yeah.
And it was significant for Gnosticism and for Middle Platonism. So you see these overlapping ideas.
Like what, specifically?
Like the whole spirit-matter duality. That idea of an inner divine spark versus the physical body.
Okay.
And both traditions talk about a higher transcendent divine realm. Gnostics often called it the pleroma, this realm of fullness. Plato, of course, had his realm of forms or ideas.
Right, the forms. But here's a major difference, isn't it? The demiurge, the creator figure.
Ah, yes, big difference.
In Platonism, he's more like a craftsman, divine, skilled.
Right, working with pre-existing matter to shape the cosmos based on the forms, but in a lot of Gnostic thought, well, it's darker. The demiurge is often seen as flawed or ignorant, sometimes even malicious, and crucially, sometimes identified with the God of the Old Testament.
Wow, okay. That's a fundamental shift. And that explains their negative view of the material world, too.
It certainly contributes. For many Gnostics, it's like a prison created by this lesser being. Whereas for Plato, the material world is, well, maybe imperfect, but still a reflection, however faint, of the perfect forms. More neutral, maybe.
Got it. Okay, so Egypt, Greece. Now let's talk about the Jewish influences. This feels potentially complicated.
It is, yeah. Some scholarship points towards Judeo-Christian origins for Gnosticism, suggesting it emerged from certain non-rabbinic Jewish groups or early Christian sects.
So what kind of Jewish ideas are we seeing reflected?
Well, there's this concept sometimes called Jewish gnosis, which you might see in like Merkaba mysticism.
That's the visions of the divine throne, the chariot.
Exactly. And the kind of visionary imagery there shares some ground with Gnostic descriptions of the divine realms. Plus, Gnostics definitely use Hebrew names for God and angels.
And didn't they also sort of reinterpret Old Testament stories, sometimes flipping them?
Oh, absolutely. That's classic Gnostic technique. Take the serpent in the Garden of Eden.
Usually the bad guy.
Right. But in some Gnostic texts, the serpent is actually seen as a positive figure, bringing knowledge gnosis to Adam and Eve, trying to free them from the ignorant demiurge.
Who they identified with Yahweh.
Often, yes. Viewing the Old Testament God as that lesser, perhaps flawed or even malevolent creator figure we talked about, that was obviously very controversial.
You think, yeah. Okay, so pulling it all together then, Gnosticism really looks like this incredible synthesis, doesn't it?
It really does. It seems to take Egyptian ideas about inner knowledge, perhaps some cosmological structures.
Mixes them with the philosophical framework from Platonism, like duality and transcendence.
And then radically reinterprets Jewish narratives and figures to create something, well, unique and quite challenging for its time.
So, as you can see from this deep dive, Gnosticism wasn't just one thing. It was this really vibrant, evolving landscape of ideas at a crossroads of ancient cultures.
Absolutely. Not monolithic at all, a dynamic interplay.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? How these ancient ideas about reality, the divine spark, the importance of knowledge, how they might still echo today, maybe in ways we don't always recognize.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thought. What part of this this unique blend of influences stands out most to you? What resonates?
Definitely something to ponder. And if you want to explore this further, looking into the actual text from the Nag Hammadi library, or even reading what the early church fathers wrote against Gnosticism, that would be a great next step.
For sure. This is really just scratching the surface of a very deep and complex subject.
The Syriac-Egyptian school was a Gnostic school that derived much of its general form from Platonic influences. Typically, it presents creation as a series of emanations from monadic primal source, ultimately resulting in the creation of the material universe. As a consequence, there is a tendency in these schools to view evil, or wickedness, as matter, inferior goodness, lacking spiritual inspiration and goodness. Rather than portraying it as an equal force, it can be said that these Gnostic schools use the terms good and evil as relative terms, as they refer to the relative predicaments of human existence, caught between these realities and confused in its orientation, with evil indicating the extreme distance from the principle and source of good without necessarily emphasizing an inherent negativity, sources related to Christianity, with some even identifying themselves as Christian, albeit in a distinctly different way from the so-called Orthodox or Roman Catholic forms.
Dogmatic Christology and existential Christology. Christology has sometimes been understood primarily as dogmatic, that is, based on the dogmas defined the Council of the first centuries, which sought to eradicate Arianism and all forms of gnosis as understood today, in particular those of Nicaea and Chalcedon. Such a conception did not allow for the danger of arriving at an abstract elaboration, too systematically conceptual and too separated from rhe role work of salvation. As a reaction, some theologians wanted to promote a more existential and less essential Christology, a Christology that appeals to experience, not only that of the Oringians, but also that of the present church. It is true that Christology comes from a unique initial experience, in which Christ revealed his own mystery to his disciples. Here we understand all the origins and controversies of the famous Gnosis. Al-Toag, I believe, that it precedes Christianity and has its origins in Egypt and the Hebrews, although our exact sources of this historical influence. The coming of the Son of God into the world constitutes in itself an exceptional experience of a divine person living a human life, an experience that could be reduced to the condition of the common experience of men, but must be recognized in all its transcendent character. There were the experience of the disciples who lived with Christ, received his revelation, and transmitted it to subsequent generations. In each era of Christ, experience and faith defined by the evangelical revelation. The Christology, if the councils are in reality the fruit of the experiences of the Church, of the experience of faith that develops and seeks to better define Christ, to whom the declarations of Nicaea and Chalcedon adhere. They are professions of faith, the result of an ever deeper reflection. It must be added that the experience of Christian faith cannot preserve its own authenticity unless it recognizes itself in the professions of faith of the Church and is supported by them. Dogmatic Christology receives its own dynamism from the fact that it is placed in the existential perspective of the work of revelation and salvation. Existential Christology. Historical and charismatic Christology is the starting point, the Christ of faith, or the historical Jesus. Some theologians have expressed the difference by distinguishing between Jesusology and Christology. Jesus is the man who lived historically in Palestine, and Christ is the one proclaimed in our faith. In fact, the answer to his problem does not consist in opting for one and excluding the other. On the one hand, we must admit the objective priority of the historical Jesus. And in this sense, we must speak of a Christology from below. On the other hand, there is a subjective priority of the knowledge of faith. And therefore, we must speak of Christology from above. The goal of Christology is the Jesus of history. Christianity began as a historical event. It was not born from the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. I will not go into details here, whether Nazareth really existed or whether Nazareth or the term Nazarenes referred to a Hebrew sect. Therefore, all Christology is Jesusology. Christ can only be the historical Jesus. The Jesus of history must therefore be studied in his entire earthly life, as recorded in the Gospel. As a starting point for Christology, we cannot refer simply to the resurrected Christ, as if revelation determined only the resurrection and could only arouse faith from that moment onwards. In reality, Jesus revealed his identity as the Son of God in his public life, and, long before his resurrection, asked his disciples for a profession of faith. The resurrection brought a new light, which nevertheless confirmed, in substance, the previous words and gestures of Jesus. Christ manifested himself as the Son of God and as Savior in the historical condition of his earthly life, and not only in his state of glory. Therefore, objectively, Christology develops from the Jesus of history, although this does not deny that subjectively it has a starting point in the Christ of faith. Those who undertake the study of Christology noemically have knowledge and a conviction of faith that serve a basis for intellectual effort. Faith demands such effort in order to better understand what it believes. It uses all the resources and means of exegetically and historical science to develop the person of Jesus as he appears in history. Consequently, those who make the effort to discover the historical Christ must not dispense with their own faith. They respect that directs them towards the truth. This is not only their individual faith, but the faith of the Church, a faith transmitted by a long tradition and always evolving.